When you're looking at real estate deals, it's really important to understand how much work you're going to have to put into the deal. A lot of times it's tempting to go with the property, if you're looking at two different ones, to go with the property that has higher cash on cash return just based on that factor alone. But what I've found through experience is that a lot of the properties that need a lot of work look really good on paper. But when I start factoring how much time I'm going to have to spend to get the deal accomplished, it starts looking a lot worse. So, in this example, we're going to go through a couple of different hypothetical scenarios to explain kind of what you can look out for to make sure that you're not just getting yourself a second job that's not really going to give you any passive income, right? Because in this example, we want to make sure that we distinguish between what is active income and what is passive. And just because you have a piece of real estate doesn't mean all the cash flow you get from it is passive. A lot of it will be active. So in this first example, we're going to look at two different houses. One is an Airbnb, which is very operations heavy, right? You've got to do clean outs. You've got to make sure you take care of the guest experience. And you're going to have tons of different tenants throughout 1 year. The next example, we see a house, one house, a single family house, and you're going to get tenants in there for 12 months at a time. When you look at the pro formas on the deal, the Airbnb could get you as high as 25% cash on cash return, which is why they're very popular and why a lot of people like investing in Airbnbs. The house is pretty vanilla, right? 8% cash on cash return. It's not all that exciting. There's a lot of different stuff you could do to get that kind of money, but it's not really going to change your life. So it's not something people put a lot of attention into. But that house doesn't really take any time at all out of your day as an owner. So let's look at the Airbnb. If we spend about 5 hours a week, now I've never owned an Airbnb, so I don't know if that's realistic or not, but I would assume from some of the people I've talked to that is probably a realistic amount. Over a given year, if we're spending $50 an hour and that's the hourly rate we assign to ourselves, we're really hardly cash flowing at all. We're really only getting $500 worth of passive income because $12,000 of what we did was through our active work. So that might be fine. And you might have a business model built around that, but it's important to understand going into it, it's not passive income. So you can't be really surprised when you get three or four of these properties and next thing you know, it's kind of a full-time job, right? Like I said, that might be your goal, but if your goal is passive income, you need to make sure you distinguish the two. Now, there are some options. Let's say you've done this already. You've got yourself in a deal, and it doesn't have to just be houses. It could be any asset class where it's very operations heavy. And now you're sitting there thinking, okay, I've already bought it, but how can I make this more passive? Well, one of the easiest ways to start will be to hire an assistant. In this next example, we're going to look at the exact same two properties, the same two deals, and we're just going to assume that on one of them, we end up hiring an assistant to do a lot of the work we would do. So, one of the best ways to accomplish this is to detail and write down every single task that you do on the property more than once. Now, when you start doing this and you start turning it into a standard operating procedure, you'd be surprised how quickly you can actually hire somebody to go and do the same thing that you did. And I know from my experience, a lot of times there were things that I thought I was the only one who was going to be able to do it. But after I wrote it down a couple of times, I realized it's just a simple 1, 2, 3 scenario. It's not really rocket science. And, side note, I think using AI is a really good way to accomplish this because you can basically just word vomit what your process is and it'll write it out into a neat process that an assistant can follow. But anyways, when we look at this scenario, let's say now we only work 1 hour a week, whereas before we were working about five. That means we're only going to spend about $50 a month, or the property is going to spend about $50 a month on our time that we spend managing it. Now, you'll see in the example below, the weekly hours for our assistant is actually higher than it was when we started. And that's okay, right? What we need to understand is that somebody else who's not the business owner is going to take a longer time to do the same tasks. But you shouldn't expect them to do it just as quickly as you, because for you, it's very obvious and you don't have to read or get permission or make sure you're doing things right. You just do it. So when you hire an assistant, it's important to understand that they will be slower than you, but that's okay because their rate is much lower. In this example, we only spend about $10 an hour on the labor for somebody to do that kind of work. And what that means is that at the end of the year, we actually have a lot more passive income because we're basically saving the difference between what our hourly rate would be and what we're paying somebody else to do the same work. So that turns that investment, which in the previous example is about 1% passive income, now we're getting about 14% cash on cash return. So in this example, we compare that to the home, and To be honest with you, I don't really know what you would hire a virtual assistant to help with when it comes to just owning a passive investment of a stabilized house, because in the previous example there wasn't much there. But for the sake of comparison, I went ahead and assumed we did, and it doesn't really change it. There wasn't much work to begin with, so hiring an assistant doesn't really get us much. So in this example, we can see if we're good at hiring somebody else to do what we did for the property, that investment now makes a lot more sense. Now, it might be the case that the property's operations are not something an assistant can help with. Maybe it's very hands-on. Maybe it's something that you have to physically be there and you can't hire somebody locally to do it for that price. But what you end up doing is you bring in one additional partner who's going to split the work with you. So you both put in the same amount and you both split how much work there is to be done. So in this example, really all we see that's different is that our weekly hours gets dropped in half. Our investment is the same. So technically, maybe it would be a little bit more of an investment or a little bit less of an investment, depending on the deal. But when we just look at the idea of our partner's going to do half the work on each deal, we are going to do half of what we used to do. So in this example, again, our cash on cash return and our actual passive income from the investment is higher than it was just doing it ourselves and doing all of the work. So in this case, that's why you see a lot of people who struggle going from single families to other types of investment, because they don't have the mindset that they should be partnering. And really, partnering is one of the best ways to make this happen, because it actually generates cash flow rather than just all of the work falling on you. It's very rare that somebody has all the skill sets and likes all of the things that you need to do when you own a piece of when you own a piece of real estate. You might love the design, you might love creating a great experience for guests, but I'd be willing to bet you probably hate doing the books. I'm kind of the opposite. I don't understand a guest experience. I don't understand anything. That's why I work on mobile home parks, because they're simple. They're just pretty much numbers, right? So I know which part of the business I like, and I have other people do the parts I'm not good at and I don't like. Maybe you don't want to hire somebody to do your work, and maybe you don't want to partner with somebody. But there is still a way that you can make that cash on cash return and that passive income higher than in the first example we gave, which is through doing bigger deals. Now, this is based on the assumption that when you do a bigger deal, you still have the same time commitment that you would on a smaller one, which may or may not be true, but I tend to think that it actually is surprisingly true. When you start getting some scale, you'd be surprised. One commercial property, one larger property might actually be the same work to you as the owner as it would be a single family property. So in this example, let's say we invested 3 times as much and got a property 3 times as big as the first example. Same cash on cash return, and we're still going to do the same amount of work. But when we break it all down at the end of the year, that amount of work, that hourly rate, even after we pay ourselves that from the property, the cash flow left over is much greater. So our passive income, therefore, is much greater. So this is a really good route to go. And this is why you see a lot of people do 1 or 2 single family houses or relatively small commercial deals, and then realize they need to start getting into bigger deals because they only have so much time. So they want to make sure that they spend their time getting the best bang for their buck possible, right? If we look at that same scenario where you spent 3 times as much on one house, but you still didn't do much work, well, you're just going to do a bigger deal and get more cash on cash, more cash flow, but your cash on cash return is going to stay the same. So it stands to reason when you start getting into bigger deals, the operations become a much less part of the entire net operating income. So more of it's passive. One of the final options when it comes to making your investment in a deal is to just completely be passive in general. The property doesn't need to be a passive property. It can be a value add deal, it can be a development, but your role in the deal is passive. So a lot of people end up doing this just because they have a high paying job or a high stress job, or they have a business that they run full time, and they don't have the time that they need to designate to finding and closing and financing and operating and managing and bookkeeping for a deal. They just want to put the investment in and be done with it. So a common way you'll see this is through joint ventures or through syndications. So in this example, we're going to compare basically putting money into a deal as an LP versus just putting that money into a deal in a single family home by yourself. Now, an LP stands for limited partner. So it basically means that your expectation in the deal is just writing a check and placing capital into it. That's it. That's all you have to do. And then on the flip side, you have an operator who doesn't put in capital or might put in capital, but they're not going to be they're going to be doing all the work to the deal itself. So in this example, let's say it's the same investment, 50,000, and the cash on cash on the two deals is different. So that obviously that is not an apples to apples comparison. But typically what you'll find on a bigger deal like that, the cash on cash return for the deal itself is higher than just some single family house investment. Now, waterfalls for these kind of deals can get split a million different ways, but in this particular example, we're going to go with a fairly common one, which is that there's an 8% preferred return, and then the profit from there is split 50-50. That preferred return can get confusing, but the best way to think of it is the first 8% of cash on cash return goes to the investor or the limited partner, and the rest of it goes to the general partner after that, and it gets split, right? So in this case, if it was 15% cash on cash return, 8% goes to the investor, and then the remaining 7% gets split 50-50. And in that case, as an LP, there's no time to calculate. There are no time expectations of the LP in a deal. So they're basically just writing the check. So any money they get from this is completely passive. Whereas in the other deal, they're still going to do some work. It's relatively stable. They own all of it. They don't split it with anybody. But industry standards for what you kind of see on cash return for those type of deals is still lower. So ultimately, I think what a lot of people end up finding from doing these investments is that they can invest in real estate, but they don't necessarily have to do any of the work, and they can get better returns as if they did the deal themselves. So it can be pretty advantageous. But ultimately, it all comes down to this. If you got into real estate investing, it's probably because you wanted to replace your active income with passive income. And so it's really tempting to try to find deals where your cash on cash return is as high as possible. But more often than not, that's going to be a second business. It might be disguised as real estate. It might be a piece of real estate. But if it's something that you have to work on all the time, don't fool yourself. You've got a business. So if the goal is passive income, make sure you figure out a way to maximize that part of your investment.